As a descendant of Melbourne's first people, the Bunurong people of the great southeastern Kulin nations, I'm pleased to be able to welcome you here today on behalf of Papanata Caroline Briggs AM. You are standing on the traditional country of the Bunurong people, who are one of the 5 language groups that make up the southeastern Kulin nations, which covers central Victoria. These groups being the Bunurong, the Woiwurrung, the Tanarong, the Dja-Dja-Wurrung, and the Wadawurrung. Our traditional country now consists of a great multicultural city we now know as Melbourne. The importance of this land in our culture, the spirit of Bunjil and his gifts of generosity still influence this land and our people today. The word welcome in Bunurong language is Wominjeka, but its translation to English is to come. I'm asking you to come, but come with purpose. It's also a spoken contract between the Bunurong as a custodians of this country and yourselves to ensure laws are adhered to and to guarantee safe passage for those who ask. According to traditions, this land has always been protected by our creator Bunjil and Wa, who protects the waterways and travels as a crow. Bunjil taught the Bunurong people to always welcome guests, but requires us to ask all visitors to make 2 promises, which we've asked you today: to obey the laws of Bunjil and to not harm the children or the land of Bunjil. This commitment was made through exchange of a small bowl dipped in water and the spoken words, Wominjeka. So Wominjeka, Nam Burp, sorry. Wominjeka, Nam Burp, Burp. Sorry, my apologies. Wominjeka, Nam Bik, Nam, Bik Bik Bunurong, Nam Derp Rotten, Ata Willem. Finally got it out. Come with purpose to our beautiful home, the land of the 2 bays. This is Bunurong country. Welcome, guys. Ngujin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for that. Welcome to country and the smoking ceremony upstairs as well. Very powerful. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Professor Dan Hill. I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, Indy Johar, shortly. Before we get going, I'd also like to pay my respects to the original custodians of the unceded land on which we're gathering here tonight, which are the peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations, as you just heard from David, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to respect their knowledge of country and materials that has endured for over 70,000 years. We're here to listen to stories, ideas, and perspectives on many things tonight, but they'll all revolve around ideas we could equally draw from Indigenous knowledge systems or Indigenous ways of knowing and acting around materials, settlement, habitation, cultivation, kinship, relationships, and country. And I want to acknowledge and pay my respect to what we might learn from that as well together. I'm about to hand over to Indy Johar to deliver the opening address in our Retrofit Symposium. This is the faculty's annual symposium, and this year is led by Professor Sarah Bell and team. Where's Sarah? She's in here somewhere. There you go. Who's director of Retrofit Lab here as well. And so please seek out Sarah or Brendan McNiven, where are you, over there? Or indeed me, or anybody else from the faculty. If you want to find out more about what's going to happen over the next couple of days here, and then keep an eye on the website afterwards, because there'll be lots of recordings up there of the events, and sign up to the mailing lists that you'll find on the Retrofit Lab website as well. But a few words first before I welcome up Indy, an old friend and colleague and compatriot who I'm delighted to have with us here. Indy is founder of Dark Matter Labs, director and co-founder of 00 Architecture, Open Systems Lab. I could embarrass him by going on and on about his bio, but I just said to him, you can just look him up on the internet. You'll find lots of things about him there. It's an amazing array of work and discussion and thinking. So I urge you to go and look at that afterwards. He's here with us all week here at Melbourne School of Design as this year's Robert Garland Tresidder Fellow, doing numerous events and discussions with staff and students and collaborators. We've done 2 workshops with him alone today, so we're really squeezing all of the time we can get out of him. And we're extremely grateful to the Tresidder Fellowship for helping make that happen. As you'll hear, Indy is both the perfect person to have here as the Tresidder Fellow and to kick off the Retrofit Symposium. He embodies an entirely different conception of design to one carried out by most, I think. If I frame MSD, Melbourne School of Design, as a design school for the 21st century, which I increasingly do, then Indy, to a large extent, embodies a lot of the design practice we might lead for the 21st century, if not the one after that as well, and the one after that. He'll challenge us tonight to think hard before we start retrofitting, never mind building. He'll challenge us to somehow conjure new cities from existing cities without building in the old sense at all, to create new industries, ideals, pursuits, dreams, communities, ways of doing. In particular, he and I and many others here are exploring the next frontiers for design in terms of the very hard limits on materiality itself, as you'll hear, as well as broader care for the environment and each other. But whenever we make a house or a building, we're making a hole somewhere else, or a series of holes, obviously, in reality, in what feminist geographer Val Plumwood called shadow places. The built environment sector, if we pull the string on it and explore its systems around it, is directly linked to the most extractive industries on the planet, such as sand mining, for instance, from which we get cement and concrete and numerous other things. There's really no excuse for making buildings in this way at this point. And as you'll hear, even retrofit is not the simple, straightforward, viable route out of the cul-de-sac that we've driven ourselves into after carving it for ourselves. We see in our living environments the way we make things, what we stand for as a society, what we're about. And currently in Australia, as elsewhere, it does not speak well to our understanding of the environment or each other or our kinship relationships more broadly. And we won't understand what buildings can be, what places might be, what infrastructures might be, just by staring hard at them. As Richard Sennett once said, you don't understand how to make wine just by drinking lots of it. We have to go beyond this to wrangle with what my friend here and I would call the dark matter, the systems, the conditions, the frameworks, the protocols, the codes, the legal structures, the ownership models, the decision-making cultures behind or beneath the matter that we see around us. That is where the systems change possibility is. We do this with hope, actually, hope in the sense that Rebecca Solnit describes, not optimism. Optimists assume everything's going to be okay, so they don't really do anything. Solnit says that hope is something we actually have to make happen. We have to do it. This is where the design work is next, where we need to go. And I can think of no one who has worked harder at that, is more brilliant and and perhaps more hopeful about this than my friend Indy Johar. So please welcome him to the stage.
Good afternoon. I'm really honored and delighted to be here. Thank you for such a generous introduction. I'm actually incredibly grateful to all of you for your time here. As part of this conversation, I want to take the opportunity to set a scene. When we talk about retrofit, I think one of the big questions we have is, what are we retrofitting into? And what does the world look like over the next 10 years? And I think the next 10 years are going to be one of the most extraordinary transition moments that we're going to face, perhaps maybe has faced in the last 400 years. And the reason why I say that is that I think when you start to look at some of the numbers and some of the realities that we're facing, I think there are order of magnitude that I think many of us are not actually factoring in to some of our work and some of our decisions that we're making. I want to start by this image. What this image shows you is global temperature at 2 to 2.5 degrees in 2070. And what it shows you in the dark red is spaces and environments and geographies that move outside human habitable, historic human habitable niche zones, i.e. zones and geographies where actually historically those sort of temperatures, environments, humans have not been able to thrive in. Just look at that quantum of red. And that's at 2 and 2.5 degrees. So when people talk about billions of people being on the move, what they're referring to is this sort of climatic transition. Many of you will know that in wet bulb temperatures of over about 36, 37 degrees, human beings don't survive. It's not about overall temperatures, wet bulb temperatures. And we're about to hit geographies where those sorts of environments become actually much more common and much more serious. And then I want to put that into context. We keep talking about 1.5 degrees. It's a kind of nice conversation, Paris Accord. But actually in current policy terms, we're heading between 2.7 to 3.1 degrees. That is where our current policy at a conservative level. So if you speak to security people or people from the military services, they would say 2.7 to 3.1 is a conservative estimate. We're likely heading into 5 to 6 degrees. So 2.7 to 3.1. Go back to this geography. That's at 2 and 2.5. Then let's look over time. What we're talking about is moving outside a threshold of temperature that our civilization has operated in over the last 10,000 years. Now, why is this important? Between 1.7 to 1.9 degrees, we start to lose one of the major food baskets in the world. There are 5 major food baskets in the world. This year, I don't know how many of you noticed, but India banned the export of rice. It's not the first time. We saw this happen previously. But what we're starting to see is food no longer become a global commodity, but a geopolitical decision. And as climate change and, sorry, forgive me, climate breakdown, we need to use our words more carefully. Climate change is just change. Why I say climate breakdown is the loss of predictable weather. When you lose predictable weather, you lose our capability to actually lots of our farming infrastructures. So what we're seeing is a massive increase in energy in our weather systems. That means not only do we have temperature rise, we also have increased storms, increased rainfall, increased weather events of the format. Now, why that's important is we start to lose food baskets. 1.7 to 1.9 degrees, we will lose one of the major food baskets. So let's start to put some of the numbers onto the table. 3 degrees. What does 3 degrees really mean, though? 3 degrees global average. 3 degrees global average means 5 degrees inland on average. It means 8 degrees plus in urban environments. So a summer temperature of 32 degrees in Birmingham turns into 40 degrees summer temperature. Now, these numbers are not just numbers. They're starting to show a systemic breakdown of many of our capabilities and ecological systems, food nutrition systems, to other things at the face of them. But they also sit in a broader context. They sit in a context that everyone talks about, right, we've got to move to renewable energy systems. Between 2019 and 2020, that 1 year, the global increase in energy demand was greater than all the installed renewables, the increase in energy demand in that 1 year. We have to replace oil, gas, and hydrocarbons at a rate that's unprecedented. And I want to make clear, complex civilization is a function of energy in a system. We're about to hit 10 years of systemic volatility in our availability of energy, and thereby actually large parts of our ecosystems. Our food systems are entirely reliant on hydrocarbon systems, both for energy, but also for fertilizers and other effects. So at the same time, we know that to get 2% GDP growth, we're all crying for it. Actually, just to get 2% GDP growth would mean in 25 years, we'd double our material consumption, we'd double our energy systems, and we'd double our carbon. It's almost one-to-one correlated currently. We have not sufficiently delaminated from our carbon production systemically. The delamination that's occurred is largely through the outsourcing to third-party countries, China, Vietnam, and other places. UK has done some of that and outsourced a lot of its carbon production on that basis. So why do I say all that? Because I think it's really important we understand the context of the future we're operating in. Now I'm going to try to materialize this. How many homes do you think the UK, I'm going to use UK as an example, can afford to build, United Kingdom can afford to build, if it is to follow the Paris Accord? The UK is a signatory of the Paris Accord. How many homes do you think the UK can afford to build? The government targets, Labour or Conservatives, is about 350,000 homes a year. How many homes? None. Any others? So, UK can afford to build 14,000 homes a year if it doesn't do any retrofit or anything else. If it builds 350,000 homes a year, it has no other carbon budget for anything else. Nothing. So, what does housing policy really look like in Australia, since you're all signatories of the Paris Accord? How many politicians stand up there and say, we've got to build houses? How many architects say, yeah, we're going to build houses? And how many architects say we're going to solve the problem because we're going to make them out of timber? So let me break down timber for you. Timber. If part of a global supply chain of timber, so if you use timber imported from Ukraine, US, whatever, it has a 5% difference, 5% to making out of concrete. 5%. How much do you think we have to reduce our embodied carbon by? 95%. I will show some of these numbers in more detail. Here we go. So when we look at this, a typical house, a new build house, has an embodied carbon. These are UK stats, but they won't be that dissimilar. They're not that dissimilar from many places. 800 kilograms per meter squared of carbon, embodied carbon, typical new build. A low carbon house is 150 kilograms per meter squared. We have to get to 6.3. It's not a 5% reduction, not a 10% reduction, not a 20% reduction. It's a 95% reduction. If many of you are probably business people. If I asked you to change 95% of your business, what you would do is you take your business, rip it up, and say, we'll start a new business. And and that serious. The numbers are of a different order of magnitude to the conversations that we're having. So what we have is a systemic discrepancy between what the left hand is saying and what the right hand knows. Now, I don't say this to say, stop. What I'm saying this to do is to say, let's have the conversation. Because it will force us to actually invent and appropriately invent in the 21st century, not in the material idea of the illusion of the 20th century. So if the best low carbon house can get us to 150 kilograms, we have a problem. Now I'm going to manifest it. Why did I talk about timber? Because the reality is the only way you get to timber being significantly lower is by that being part of a bioregional, biomaterial economy. So you have to be able to grow your timber locally to its demand. If you're relying on global shipping and global logistics, and if those global logistics are not decarbonized, we are nowhere close to those frameworks. Now, why is that important? How many people here are vegan? Please put your hand up. No, I've not got my hand up, right? So it's not a moral crusade. I've got one hand. Come on. 2, 3. Okay. Now the reason, 4, 5. Thank you. Thank you. I apologize. It's really important, this, because how many people here would claim that they are, how many people would say they're not Trump? We'd all put our hands up. Like, we're sensible people. We're data-driven people. We like informed decision-making. So that graph is really important. Why is it important? Those green dots, animals and birds, they're all your koalas, zebras, elephants, whatever you call them. That's it. Cattle, sheep, cats, dogs. The world is a farm on which there is a little zoo for wild animals. So when people talk about the Anthropocene, that is what they mean. Why is this important? 80% of our forest destruction is being driven by our food systems. Now, soft link back. If we're going to move towards a bioregional biomaterial economy, we are going to, in the face of climate breakdown, where we're going to actually lose soil systems, predictability of our soil systems, we're going to have to shift our land use towards agroforestry to be able, and we're going to only do that if we all become plant-based. So we're going to have to shift our diets to plant-based diets in order to be able to build the biomaterial economy for those viable timber constructions, biomaterial constructions. Now, the data around plant-based diets is not, unfortunately, it's pretty bloody solid. And most of you will probably know it's solid. But the challenge we face is we're going to have to make those types of decisions as society to be able to actually move towards those biomaterial, bioregional economies. And then this is a graph done by friends of ours, Demis Helsinki and Sitra. But I think this is really important to understand the scale of the transformation that we're talking about. So the Scandics, whilst very lovely people, are unfortunately some of the most highly carbon polluting population in the world. And the average Finn produces something between, I think, 12.5 tons per person of carbon. Now, what you'll see is if you do all those things, you see all the stuff that's left. That's what we also have to do. So let's assume you bought a solar collector, you've got a vegetarian diet, you're buying recycled foods, you're telecommuting, you're using public transport, you've got a heat pump, you're choosing local food systems, and then everything else that's left is what we still have left to do. I'm saying this because I need us to understand the scale of the transition we're facing. How many clothes do you think we can afford to buy? The idea was you can afford to buy probably between 2 to 3 pairs of clothes a year. So I'll materialize it. Sorry, I'll materialize it for you. This shirt is a 35-pound-ish shirt. I don't have expensive shirts, but if you were to price social environmental goods on it, properly price them in, it's closer to 250 to 450 pounds. 9x. Now I ask the question, what's the cost of a house? Not the construction costs, the whole system costs. So when I buy the shirt for 35 pounds, what I've done is outsource those costs to the environment, CO2, ecological damage, labor inequality, all sorts of things. I've just outsourced them to the world in order for me to buy them for 35 pounds. Unfortunately, we're moving into the world, and this is a kind of scenario moving from a perceivably infinite world where we could carry on doing that to a small world scenario where it's no longer possible to externalize those costs because those externalities are now becoming entangled. So my CO2 is no longer ignorable. It's actually increasing climate change risk, and those entanglements are becoming material to our reality. Same is true for other costs. So we're now living in a moment as we shift from a perceptibly infinite world to a small world which is entangled, and those externalities are no longer systemically externalizable. They are re-entangling. Now, those worldview shifts are actually very fundamental. That is a shift in a worldview, and I'm going to make this case later on, of what I would say is a Newtonian Enlightenment worldview, which allowed for us to separate ourselves from the world. In the act of separation, we could use perspective, distance, classification theory, racialization. All these things were a means to allow for permission of violence. It was a worldview that separated us. Unfortunately, or fortunately, that worldview is now ending. And it's driven by the re-entanglement of these feedback systems, but also re-entanglement at the level of our understanding of science and other things. So we're living through this worldview shift. And in that worldview shift, what we're seeing is volatility is making that system apparent. Now, why do I talk about the shirt and the house? Because I think it opens up some much more fundamental questions about affordability to whom. What is my life? How many shirts am I going to be able to afford? What is my relationship to a future economy? What is my relationship to a material economy? What does that future really look like? And much of that needs to change and will be required to change. And this needs to be seen in a systemic context. So when people talk about energy, and I remember I made this point, that energy is perfectly correlated to complex civilizations. Energy is perfectly correlated to complex civilizations. In the 1920s, 1 barrel of oil, energy worth equivalent, we would get 120 barrels of oil released. That was the input energy releasing 120 barrels. 2020, 1 barrel of oil releases 7 barrels of oil. So in terms of peak energy of civilization, we've already hit it. We are no longer getting the quantum of energy available in the system as we were used to. And too often in our conversations, we have this, we're doing a lot of work with cities across Europe and other places where people say, right, we've got to electrify our cities. Move towards electricity. And you say, that's fantastic. So tell me about copper supply. What you figure out very quickly, yes, there are vast reserves of copper. And something like 90% of our biodiversity losses are driven through mining. There are vast supplies of copper, but as we move from a hydrocarbon economy to a mineral economy, it's important, that's the move, we are going to actually destroy vast amounts of our biodiversity systems to be able to unlock that. However, it takes 10 years to open up a copper mine, 10 to 15 years. If you look at the available copper supply, which is already pre-programmed in, we do not have the copper supply over the next 10 years to electrify the cities that we're trying to do. So it is no longer sufficient to just look at the idea of infinite resources in the short term and look at what you want to do. We're going to have to think backwards and forwards into what's available in the supply chain and the impact of those things to make those decisions. So it's really critical that we start to think very, very carefully about what this transition really looks like and what the means of that transition is. And this is not some 2030 scenario, unfortunately. So Denmark has already hit its 1.5 degrees carbon budget. But why is that important? Well, what it means, I'll jump straight to a retrofit problem. What it means is that we are now in a situation, so a deep retrofit in the UK, which was done in 2003 in Birmingham, had an embodied carbon of 125 kilograms per meter squared. Brilliantly done retrofit, by the way. It took 21 years to recover that carbon in operational terms. So retrofit will require us to release carbon into the air, and over the next 21 years, we'll claw it back. Our problem is we are now in Never Never Land, as in, yes, we release the carbon, but the only way to pull it back is going to require carbon sequestration technologies which are unknown. And we don't have the capacity to release that carbon and pull back in 21 years because we're already hitting our budgets. So there are some real material issues starting to come on the table. And those issues, just so we know the scale of the extinction level event that we're operating, the level of extinction rate is right now greater than it's ever been outside the major extinctions driven by meteorite strikes to the planet. And as we move from a hydrocarbon economy to a minerals economy, in the interstitial period, when you run both economies, we will massively increase our mining capacity. That will have significant impact on our ecological systems. Over time, yes, our hydrocarbon economy actually consumes a huge amount of mining industry resources. That will decline. But however, renewables are not in infinite energy supply systems currently. 15, 20 years for solar panels, 12 to 14 years for wind turbines. We need to actually continuously mine. We do not have renewable sources of those mineral sources. So why I'm saying all this stuff is the nature of the crisis that we face is not just climate breakdown, but actually a nest of other crises. As volatility increases in our system, there was a 40% hike last year in food prices in the UK. As energy prices more than doubled, if not tripled, in the UK, what was the impact? Greater inequality. So as volatility increases, we're going to see those that are most vulnerable becoming more and more fragile and actually more and more in situations of great risk. In fact, most of the best climate scientists are saying it's not the climate that's going to kill us. It's going to be actually social tipping points, where inequality and other issues break down our capacity to hold society together. So again, language. Climate breakdown. The loss of predictable weather means we lose insurability. Insurability means you lose capital markets. You cannot get a mortgage on a house which you cannot insure. Not far from here, maybe I think 2 hours away, there are houses expected to effectively become non-insurable in next 2 years. You go to Nova Scotia, there is housing which is non-insurable right now. California, Miami, parts of the world which are no longer becoming insurable. By implication, you cannot get mortgages, and they are now sitting outside the traditional capital markets. Farming becomes non-insurable. So the fragility in the system will systemically increase. So why am I saying all this? Is that I think when we start to look at the scale of the transformation we're facing a systemic transformation at every layer of our economy. I would put forth to you I'm going to put forth to you that this is very much like the Industrial Revolution, where we're going to have to change our energy source, our nutrition sources, our material sources, our human development sources. Every one of the foundations of actually our society is going to be transformed over the period next 40 years and less. So let's talk about the transformation of our material economy. We are going to have to make our economy significantly less focused on material goods. Intangible assets, intangible value will increasingly become the source of growth in society. Creativity, care, complex cognition, these will be the sources of assets and value in the 21st century. We will have to make our material economy significantly more durable. And we will have to make our material economy significantly more bioregionally, biomaterially circular. Every one of those moves is going to happen. We're going to have to fundamentally shift our nutrition economy, our food systems, as I spoke about earlier. We're going to have to change our energy systems. We're going to have to rebuild our biodiversity and our ecological services landscape. And we're going to have to reinvest in human development as we deal with, I would argue, a kind of a new post-labor economy. Our labor economy is built around a thesis of instrumentalization of humans as units of instructability, humans as bad robots. It's great for an industrial age. It isn't an appropriate function for complex care creative economies because they are driven not through instructability, they're driven through intrinsic capabilities and intrinsic desires. As we move into a machine-assisted economy, we are going to look at a transformation of what a human economy looks like for the 21st century. Look at people like Ruth Gilmore's work on life-affirming economies, which move us out of the paradigm of control and management and punishment systems to life-affirming economics. And by life, I expand the thesis of life to human, non-human systems, and even machine systems. Right? We see the world through a language of dead things. Our theory of property, in order to construct property, you have to be able to objectify something, and you have to be able to not only objectify it, you have to build asymmetric, it's property rights. So anyone heard of property responsibilities? It's asymmetric rights. It's the enslavement of one thing to the needs of the other. So this is a foundational transformation of every layer of our economy. And like the rhetoric, I want us to understand the scale of the transformation. Everyone talks about circular economies. Really, it's like glib almost. But those are your numbers. 4%. Denmark is one of the most advanced circular economies in the modern world, in the developed world, however you want to call it. 4%. And it's falling, by the way, unfortunately. The number's not increasing, it's falling. We need to get this into the 80s and 90s. Now, it is of that order of magnitude of transformation that we're looking at. And why I'm saying all this is that it is no longer sufficient to say, hey, I've reduced carbon, embodied carbon by 5%, 10%, 20%. We are nowhere close to the problem space. And it's going to force us to think much more structurally about how do we provide spatial justice. Australians have the largest homes per square meter in the world, I think. Is that just? Just asking. You have a housing crisis. Do you have a housing crisis or do you have a hoarding of space crisis? And I think those are important questions. Because how we deliver spatial justice is no longer going to be possible by just material supply side provision. Because we don't have the carbon and the mineral sources, certainly for a period, to be able to provide that as a solution. It will take us 20 years, if not longer, to build the biomaterial economies to be able to solve that in a different way. There is a time problem here. And like I said, the social tipping points come at us much faster. So in the next 10 to 20 years, I think we're going to demand and need radical innovation around how we provide spatial justice. And this requires us to think quite fundamentally about how we infrastructure our futures. So what does retrofit look like? What do these futures look like? So the rhetoric right now is extraordinary. The European Commission, European Union, is looking at 250 million homes being retrofitted. Those are the targets. However, we already know there's no carbon budget, but we also know there's no labor. And we also know there isn't the material supply. Other than that, it's a great strategy. And that's the problem. It's a great strategy. We don't have the labor, we don't have the material sources, we don't have the carbon budgets. How do we deal with that? And this is where this diagram becomes interesting. In order to get to those scales of responses, we're going to have to deal with some really difficult innovation spaces. How do we provide comfort in buildings? What does comfort really look like? What is our theory of comfort? Is it going to be with space heating a whole building? Or is it you're going to be wearing chemically assisted heating and cooling clothes? You're going to be wearing more clothes, less clothes. If some of you will probably know that most of our buildings are massively over-engineered. Why are they over-engineered? Because we don't like flex in our beams and our structures. And the scale of that massive over-engineering is perhaps in the order of 90% additional materiality. It's not minor, massive. So how do we start to operationalize this? How do we start to actually build the material economies that are required? If we are going to invest in new buildings, how are we going to do them so that actually we release space in our built environment? So for example, do we have to invest in shared infrastructures? So Georges Monbiot said very eloquently, we need a future of public luxury and private sufficiency. So how do we actually release space in our housing, release space for intergenerational care? Australia is no different from most of Europe. Most of your local authorities are going to go bankrupt as a result of care budgets. How are we going to reinvent our care of our societies at the same time as we make this transition? How are we going to drive the material innovation? And the material innovation is not simple. Let me just sort of unfold it for you. So Professor John Schnellhuber, who eminent sort of part of the IPCC report and various other things, talks quite eloquently about what we need in terms of having our forests to act as carbon pumps. Now, that's great. So our forests are going to have to act as carbon pumps, sucking carbon out. We're going to need to store that carbon for 200 years, which means that when you build a building, we need the timber to survive for 200 years. So when somebody shows me, and I was in a hotel in Amsterdam, and somebody had this little timber card saying, "Oh, isn't that great?" I was like, "Fuck, that's really not great." So sacrificial timber, is that okay? 40-year lifespan timber, is that okay? Not really, if we have to release that carbon back into the air in 40 years' time. How do we imagine buildings? The average building lifespan is less than 25 years. How do we build buildings that are going to have, they are no longer going to be programmatically built? So a lot of the work that we're doing is now looking at asset classes and buildings which are not office blocks. They are pieces of infrastructure with programs that will have to evolve. So suddenly, it isn't a category A office that you're buying a piece of infrastructure which has got material which will be durable, sustainable, and will sequester that carbon. And you're buying the locational advantage of that environment, and the program will have to evolve over time. So our theory of asset codes, our theory of financing, material registries of that building, the carbon sequestration proof of that building, differential discount rates of the materials of that building and how it's done. There's a whole institutional economy that has to be constructed around the materials of our building for that future. Now, I show this because I think sometimes we think this stuff is, we'll just put some hempcrete and it's all sorted. Yes, hempcrete gets you to this. By the way, this does not include any production material sort of costs or carbon. So any production logistics stuff is not included. So even when we get to those carbon numbers, we've got huge amounts of work to do to actually get to those logistics and infrastructure. This was my point about a zero carbon house. Retrofit. 21 years to get to net zero. And what this demands, I think, will be 3 orders of massive, significant transformation. Reimagining comfort. Reimagining our provision towards shared infrastructures and shared provisions. And thirdly, rebuilding a new biomaterial, bioregional economy. And anyone that's serious, any place that's serious, is going to have to do these at different times in different spaces simultaneously. If you wait 10 more years, you don't have access to that biomaterial economy for another 20 years. So we're going to have to start to make these transitions significantly simultaneously. And it has massive, when we talk about the transformations that we're talking about, you start to look at a completely different class of tactics. It's not like the quaint, oversized houses. We don't have the labor force for it. We don't even have the labor force for some of the deep retrofit everyone talks about. We're talking about houses having to be painted white to reduce temperature gradients. We're talking about some rooms being cool and warm rooms. We're starting to have to think fundamentally differently about many of these environments and provisions. And this goes all the way through to how we share our infrastructures, rainwater, various other things, but how much of this economy has to be built organically and at time. We'll be releasing a piece of work on 3-degree neighborhoods, which actually lists out much of the carbon solutions and what they are, and how do you build mixed economies around this stuff. So what is a community DIY economy? What is an infrastructure provision economy, and how do you finance it and structure it? And why I'm saying all this is that I think the challenge of retrofit is genuinely a systemic challenge. And it requires us to think really deeply. And that's why I'm really grateful for Melbourne University and Sarah and Dan and colleagues to be having this conversation. I think this is a real structural innovation challenge. And what I want to say here is that why I think this is important is not to make us afraid, not to say nothing is possible, but what I want to say is the future is not going to be built by building new Zaha Hadid retrofits. The innovation space is fundamentally different. The contribution of architecture and design will be fundamentally different. It requires architects to not only look up the chain, but actually down the chain and where the supply chains are coming for and what that means. It requires Victoria and other lots of governments to start to talk about building bioregional economies, shift land use, organize those land use transitions in fundamentally structural ways. Build bioregional economies, build the institutional infrastructures for that material landscape, build the incentive systems around that. And so it's in this context that this response is required. But underneath this response, I think there's also two fundamental questions. So what we've described here is the solution space, but underneath it, I think there are some fundamental questions about the entanglement of value and the entanglement of risks. So this was a piece of work that we did in Birmingham, where we looked at a private house and the social costs it generates, a poorly designed and maintained private house, and all the social and environmental costs it generates for third parties. And why I want to show this is that it's important for us to understand, I think the distinction of public and private is actually increasingly a false distinction. It's language of the 19th century that inadequately describes the entanglement of the problems that we face. And this is important for retrofit. Retrofit is not just an energy problem, it's a health problem, it's a poverty problem, it's a volatility problem, it's a social breakdown problem. It's got costs at different scales. It's got supply chain implications to it. So our classic distinctions of public and private are no longer working for addressing the economies of this stuff. You can pay for about 50% of deep retrofit approximately through energy costs. The rest come from health and social care and economics and the economic effects of those things. So you start to have to think about our financing of these things in radically different ways. And it opens up some hard questions. So we're doing work around tree canopies of cities, how to finance and govern them, and nature as infrastructure. And what you start to realize, a tree-lined street, for example, why are trees in Sheffield, I'll pick Sheffield because I know, both Dan and I know it, after 10 years, the trees were chopped down after 10 years. Why was that? Because after 10 years, the maintenance cost and the insurance cost of trees goes up. Did you know 97% of trees planted in urban environments are male trees? Sexism gets everywhere. It's actually, unfortunately, really bad because those male trees are planted because they have lower maintenance cost, but they massively increase asthma rates in our cities. So cities reduce their costs in maintenance and increase public healthcare costs as a result of high levels of pollen and asthma, because it's not on their balance sheet. So the ecological services of trees are discounted, which usually take about 40 years to deliver. So remember, a tree-lined street will reduce temperatures by 12.5 degrees. If you put rain gardens and other things, you can massively reduce flood risk and heat island effects. Road maintenance costs go down. A tree-lined street puts up to £7,000 to £10,000 of the price of every house on it. All those costs are largely, all those values are largely ignored. So how do we start to think about these things, it's going to require us to re-entangle our theories of value and accounting. I'll give you a perfect example. I used this example in earlier today, but I think it's really important. How many people here own a house in Melbourne? Please put your hand. I don't. Okay. So if I was to take your house and put it in the middle of Siberia, how much is your house worth? A lot less, I just go, because you won't be able to get the money out, currently. But let's say, so it's the middle of Siberia. How much is your house worth? Nothing, virtually. So why I'm saying that, I think this is an important philosophical point. Your house, the value of your house having appreciated in the last 20 years, which it has, imagine you've done nothing to the house, but it's still appreciated massively in value. Why is it appreciated? Right. Land is great, but the reason why land is a not brilliant answer, and I'll tell you why, is that actually, and this is a key word, your house provides you monopolistic access to key public goods. Those key public goods are labor markets, schools, parks, universities, all these things. So if you've not done any work to your house for 20 years and your house is appreciated in value, what's actually appreciated in value is those public goods. And what you've done is a second great enclosure. Those intangible public goods have been privatized into the hands of a few, those that own those monopolistic rights. This is important because I think this will be the big political conversation about actually the redistribution of value. So I would argue to you that what we've seen is a great enclosure of public value into the hands of a few people that own those monopolistic rights. And unfortunately, I think why that's really problematic is that as we move forward, the challenge becomes, how do we deal with that concentration of wealth? Many people, not just here, earn more from their houses than they do from labor and the work that they do. What we've created is an economy where we're addicted to the house, not to human productivity, human gains, human contributions. We've misaligned our economy towards non-productive assets and the growth and the hoarding of those non-productive assets, rather than seeing them as infrastructure to unfurl the capacity of all society. Last time I was here in Melbourne, I had a really shocking moment. I was sitting in an Uber, and the Uber driver was like, "Hey, how you doing?" I was like, "Hey, how you doing?" And he's like, "Yeah, yeah." I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I'm an engineer." I was like, "What?" I said, "Yeah, yeah, I'm an engineer. Worked for the top 4 engineering companies." I was like, "What are you doing driving an Uber?" He said, "I can't afford to live." He said, I've got my wife's coming back from India and I can't afford to live. I can't get a house." I was like, what the? That's a systemic destruction of the economy. And what we've done is become addicted to non-productive assets and the private accumulation of wealth with no associated labor or work or contribution. And it's the privatization of that wealth in the hands of the few. I'm saying it pretty cleanly because, like I said, just imagine your house, move it to Siberia. It isn't worth anything. Your house value comes from its locational monopolistic rights and the false attribution of those things. And why that's important, we did some work in the High Line in New York just to show it from the other side. How many of you know the High Line? So the High Line cost $178 million to build. How much land value do you think it generated? Okay, I'll give you a different question. It's really, how many, if you just took 10% of the land value uplift generated by the High Line, how much time do you think it would have taken to pay for the High Line? $178 million. Some numbers. 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Anything higher, lower, 10 minutes? 6 weeks. It's 10 months. 10 months because it generated 3.48 billion of land value uplift in under 4 years. Civic goods create value, which is privatized. So when we look at it through that lenses, I think this is one of the key things. The 21st century economy is going to be about how we are able of investing in civic entangled value systems. And if we can do that, we can unlock a new generative economy. And that becomes really fundamental. Final point. If we look at the nature of these goods, I think one of the big questions that's going to come to our table is how do we govern this future? How do we govern entangled goods? You're seeing some really interesting stuff that's happening left field, which I think is going to be really important. Rivers, self-owning, self-governing rights, nature, mountains. I love this. This is a friend of mine, Fang, who's doing work, who's a colleague of ours who works in Taiwan. Look at the material economy there. I borrow the materials from the river and I'll give them back. How do we imagine the material economy of a house not being owned, but being in relationship to the flows? How do we imagine a new material governance for the 21st century? How do we manage in territories? I love this picture. This is Indigenous nations in Turtle Island, First Nations. What's really remarkable about it is what you see is territories are overlapping. The birth of cartography, modern cartography, cut nations into nice abutments. So that was the birth of cartography. Our bureaucratic systems have constructed the world around us. As we are able to actually deal with complex cartography and new forms of bureaucracy, we're able to understand the world outside just simple space division on maps, but spatial and temporal divisions, and organizing in much richer, complex ways. How do we start to imagine new forms of governance? Embassy of the North Sea, we're doing some, I think, some really interesting work on planetary civics with colleagues at RMIT, on looking at planetary scale civic goods. How do you govern them and organize them? How do we start to talk about a fundamental shift in our relationship with the planet? One not on dominion, one not on control, one not on enslavement of the rest of the planet, but one of being in relationship to. And by the way, I don't just put in animals, I put in machine systems and housing. Imagine houses could own themselves. They weren't rent-seeking systems. Imagine you could be in treaty with a house and stewardship of the house. What does the future of governance look like in this entangled world proposition? I think this will be one of the most interesting things that's going to happen around us. How does property start to become unbundled and reorganized in this reality? How do things become intermediaries of public goods in different formats? My final point. I think this is a moment that I think is both incredibly dark, but I invite us to look at the numbers, not to be afraid of them, but I invite us to look at the numbers and what we're facing as an invitation for your greatness. This is no longer about passing the baton on to the next generation, by the way. That moment is gone. This transformation will have to occur in your lives and my lives. And this transformation will require a foundational shift in not only our energy systems, our nutrition systems, our material systems, and our material economies, and our human development economies. It will also require a foundational transformation in our worldviews and how we relate to the world. So I think the Anishinaabe Nation, for example, the language in Anishinaabe language is entirely verb orientated. The idea of noun-orientated language like English creates an object-orientated worldview. What happens if you live in a verb-orientated worldview? What happens if you don't recognize us as individuals? Because you are all multitudes. You're multitudes of organisms, but you're also a spectrum of personalities. And you're also not beings, but becomings, because you're developmental. And your intelligence is not a function of your possession, but a relationship in dialogue. This moment requires us to reimagine ourselves, reimagine our relationships with the world, and reimagine the fundamentals. And in that, we can start to talk about the scale of the transformation we're facing. And my invitation to all of us is to start to not take my words for gospel at all. But my invitation to you is look up and down. Look up and down the nature of the problem. And start to deal at the appropriate scale in that invitation. With that, I thank you for your patience and listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Indy. I'd like to think we accept the invitation. Also to, as you said, stare the numbers in the face and the cold, hard numbers, but not to be afraid of them and to have hope in that. So thank you. In a way, we don't have time for questions, but in another way, I'd like to make some time for questions. As in, I promised that I would whisk Indy away and feed him. I feel like his dad or something. I need to, unlike a male tree, he's quite high maintenance actually. But so I need to do that. But let's at least have a couple of questions because you've all been so rapt and attentive. So thank you so much for that, Jeff.
So the best decision I made today was to come to this lecture. It was absolutely extraordinary, and I sincerely thank you for it, because I think it certainly opened my eyes and probably a lot of other people into the room of the scale of the enormity that we challenge. My question is really fundamentally about your thoughts or things that have happened about how we move from here to there, the kind of scale and what it takes to happen. Because, you know, I look at the moment and I look at the UK and I look at America and I look at Australia, and I think we're becoming more divided and less unified. And from what you've spoken about here, actually what we need is unity and people coming together. I'm looking at you, so you've done some great thinking. I'm just wondering, had you done some thoughts on that transition?
I really thank you for this question. So my real hope comes from, no disrespect from anyone, it's not from the politician landscape. I was in Plymouth, for example, in a Methodist hall with community groups. And we had a pretty significant conversation at this level, like all the way down to monetary policy and the implications of monetary policy. And it was extraordinary what you can have. I mean, the number one attack I often get, just being really honest, is people go, oh, this is a bit highbrow, Andy. It's all a bit up there. On the ground, there was an 89-year-old man who once came to me, I was in Birmingham, he sort of walked over to me and said, Indy, I didn't get everything you said, but you put words into what I was feeling. I think you can feel it in your bones, most of the stats I'm giving you. They're not mine, they are things people can feel. I think the problem is no longer, I don't think the problem is the politicians. I think, if I was frankly honest with you, I think there's a Martin Luther King moment. We just need to go on the ground. This is a conversation that needs to be had eye to eye, not in a way of telling people what to do, just saying, hey, this is the context we're moving in. And my feeling is, on the ground, this is a completely different type of conversation to actually what's being intermediated at the political level. And I also feel that I would say that, you know, we were talking today about housing, and we can sell each other illusions. We're going to build 300,000 homes. It's all going to get done. And we'll like sit there and go, yeah, we're not really, because housing inflation and our material cost inflation and our labor supply inflation, it's not going to happen. But we'll keep talking to each other and never deliver that. So I think there's a moment where actually a new class of politics is made available to us. I think it would be refreshing, personally, for a politician to say, we're not going to deliver those housing. It's never going to be possible. Now the question is, what do we as society do about that? What do we do as society deliver? How do we build our material economy in different formats? I think people are waiting for someone to say that, frankly. And I have hope as I go on the ground, actually there's greater appetite to hearing this stuff because it resonates with what people are experiencing in their realities, rather than the illusions of it's all going to be okay. That's the best I can give right now.
One more question.
Thank you. Thank you for the amazing presentation. My question is around economics, because in modern economics, a rational agent, which just means average Joe, wants to consume more. And not only it wants to consume more, it wants to consume more now than it does tomorrow. So how do you realign this modern fundamental difference of a rational agent to delay the consumption? And not now, but think about the 10 years.
So it's a really fair question. I think this is it starts with a presumption of what is rationality and what is our consumer theory. So I think there's two parts of that problem. The illusion of what I would call a very limited theory of rationality. So what do we make rational decisions about, and what choice architectures that we have available to us? That's one thing. But the other thing that I think is equally and perhaps even more important is I would argue that most of our consumption is malconsumption. It's actually part of driving an addictive framework, which is non-productive, addicted framework. So we're actually producing goods which have marginal value gains for us as individuals. And there's some really brilliant work done by the book called The Wounding Machine, which says the nature of our labor, and David Graeber talks about some of this stuff around bullshit jobs, is we've created a productive economy which is so damaging to us that we use consumerism as a means to fulfill the damage our day-to-day lives, our productive economy does to us. So the violence of our means of production is actually the means that we fulfill through consumption. And if you can go to Henry Ford's Fordism thesis, where he started to pay people $5, that was the only way to retain people. That $5 allowed people to buy cars and buy consumer goods as a means to actually fulfill the damage that was done through the 9-to-5 economy and the productive and the bullshit jobs and the frameworks that were created. I think we're looking at a shift in the nature of labor and production and human capabilities to shift what I think is a mal-consumer economy. And some of the other things I would say, 40% increase in food prices, we're going to see volatility drive the system for us. We are no longer in control. Volatility will do so much of the transition. Increasingly, I'm also, unfortunately, of the mind that crisis-based transformations is what we're facing. So I think if you look at the OECD report, they're predicting a global financial crash 2.0, but in the next 6 years, we will see those frameworks shift large parts of our thesis. We are going to see crisis-based shatterings of the Overton window, and countries that are able to look at those shattering moments and reimagine their economies in those moments of negotiation are going to be really critical. So I think there's a combination of what we're building, what the nature of our production consumer economy is, and I think there's a more fundamental question about how this transformation occurs, which I think is going to be crisis-driven. I think volatility is now going to be our agent of transformation, unfortunately, which has got massive social impacts on the table.
Thank you. We could keep talking for about the next 6 or 7 hours, I suspect, about this kind of thing, but we can't. I've got to take you for some vegan food, I guess. So thank you. Well, we'll say thanks to Indy in a moment, but thanks to all of you for your engagement and attention. You've been kind of spellbound as an audience because of the speech we just heard, but also because of your engagement with that. So thank you for that. I can't think of a better way to start our retrofit symposium, which we have over the next couple of days, and to continue the work on housing and indeed system design that we're beginning to do here as well. So get in touch if you want to know more about that. Thanks to the crew for making it happen tonight. Much appreciated. With that, I think let's just all, if you join me in thanking Indy Johar, our speaker tonight.